Welcome to this mini lesson on the Porter in Macbeth. I'm actually going to just, in case anyone's watching this on like a random platform somewhere, I'm going to just write in Macbeth at the top in case you're just like, who is in what, who's the porter? Because porter's just a job that people do, so it could technically be from anywhere. So porter, before we start actually, is kind of like a servant type job. So he's a servant character in Macbeth. And for many years, teachers totally avoided this guy and didn't bother dealing with him because he's such a tiny, tiny minor character and he only appears once. And we'll go into all that in a minute. But GCSEs last year were brutal, and I can't remember which exam board it was. I think maybe AQA. One of the exam boards had a question that was the one extract that this guy's in, and it was like totally focused around him and poor people that took that exam because yeah, it's really, really mean because obviously you do all the main ones, you do like Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and so on, do all that revision, and then suddenly you're given this like complete curveball with this random little guy. So I'm doing a lesson on him, so any students from now onwards have no excuse not to know about the porter or what to say about him. And maybe, probably, I'm guessing quite a few of you will be doing that as a revision paper or a mock paper, and your teachers will have said, go Google the porter, and you'll have found this course. So hopefully that's how you found your way here anyway, in which case you're very lucky because we're about to properly go to town on this guy and figure out who he is and why he's there. So, as with all Scribbly lessons, just jot down what you need from this lesson. Don't try and write everything I say because I speak quite quickly, as you might have noticed, and I ramble, so not everything I say is super useful. So be selective about the information that's on the page and coming out of my mouth, and just write down things that's useful for you. So, firstly, you can call him the porter or porter. So, porter is the character name. Therefore, it has a capital letter. The porter is just what he is. It's like saying the servant or the waiter or something like that. So, no capital letter. So, just make sure that you have real attention to detail with your punctuation and your capitals and all that kind of stuff because it does actually make a massive difference to the impression that you give in an essay. Even if it's not specifically marked, someone whose punctuation is kind of off is not going to get like, and then you're never going to get like full marks if you're not really, really kind of neat with that. And if you are really good with that, but what you're saying is slightly off, it might get you some extra points that kind of pushes you up a level. So it's worth doing, definitely. So yeah, the porter, I'm going to call him the porter because that's just, for some reason, that's what my brain's calling him. He's a minor figure, so he's very, very small, as I mentioned before. And he's very unusual for the dark tone of the play. So generally, the tone is very, very moody, and it's about good and evil, and it's about God and the devil, and it's about the right way to organize the world versus the wrong way when humans kind of twist it and manipulate it for their own selfish purposes. So it's got these really dark, important, deep themes about humanity. And this guy is just like some tiny little comic sort of little thing in the middle of all of that darkness. So he's really different, and he's the main thing you need to do with analysing his character is talk about how he contrasts everything else in the play, especially the tone of the play. So he's a comic figure plonked into the middle of a tragic world, which is quite interesting as a concept generally. So there's a dark comic tone that he sets because of this kind of contrast of the comedy and the tragedy. He's not just like a really light-hearted, funny thing. He is sort of a bit of a broken character, as we'll see, and he makes jokes about hell, which are obviously for the time when people are hyper-religious, it's a little bit controversial. Some people might find it a bit offensive and shocking. Other people would find it hilariously funny. Whether you believe in hell or not, I think most people nowadays would find it funny rather than offensive. So you can get that contrast in as well, because you always, in your essays, need to talk about the difference between how a modern audience would interpret it versus people at the time. So either way, he's very darkly comic. So he talks about kind of dark ideas and makes jokes about them like they're nothing. So at the beginning of this scene that he's in, which is 2.3, 2 scene 3, he pretends, skipping around a little bit here, sorry. He pretends that he's the gatekeeper to the doors of hell. So he's got like these keys and he's like, oh, I've got to go open this gate because someone's knocking at the gate. And he's like, wouldn't it be funny if I was like, opening the doors to hell and there's all these sinners going to rush in and so on. So it's kind of silly because he's just like working for some king in a castle. But there is a dramatic irony there. There's a layer of irony that the porter's kind of aware and kind of not aware of at the same time, which is that the castle sort of has turned into a hell on earth because it's a place of murder and it's a place of evil and violence and madness and so on. So so it kind of has become like a mini hell really, and he's kind of picking up on that vibe, I suppose. Don't say vibe in essays. I always use this word vibe, and it's a really amazing word and I love it, but say something like atmosphere or mood, something a bit more formal and academic. So you've got this dramatic irony, and he doesn't really know how much evil has entered the castle, but the audience do, and he's sort of subconsciously maybe picking up on that because he's talking about this metaphor of these doors to the castle being the doors to hell. The next point, he is a stock character. Make sure that you have Googled this phrase, you're confident talking about it, you know exactly what it means. I'm going to briefly go over it, but it is quite a difficult term, so make sure you're confident with it. Basically, a stock character is a character that everyone knows and we generally recognize, and they're used a lot in comedy. So, like, I'm trying to think of a stock character off the top of my head. Like maybe a really beautiful but stupid girl. That kind of like comedic figure happens a lot in things, or a really angry and grumpy old man who's quite powerful. That type of character, we recognize it a lot. So a stock character is something that gets used multiple times in multiple places, and as an audience, we kind of immediately recognize that character and we know sort of what to expect from them. So they're quite important stock characters, and they're used a lot in comedy, especially traditional comedies around Shakespeare's day. So the audience would recognise him as a silly stock character figure who is meant to provide comedy, and be kind of surprised by that at the same time because they're watching a tragedy, they're not paying to watch a comedy. So as a stock character, he's a lower class drunkard type guy. So he's the lowest position in the castle. He's just a kind of servant. And he's also very, very drunk in the scene, which when it's performed, and you should always talk about performance and how the lines are going to be delivered in an actual live setting. So in a live performance, which is how it's intended to be perceived by the audience, the drunkenness would make him a lot funnier. So he'd kind of be stumbling all over and, generally acting drunk in a comedic way. But he's not unintelligent, so he's not stupid, which is really important because Shakespeare does this a lot, and it's quite progressive for his times, quite forward thinking, that lower class doesn't just mean stupid, drunk doesn't just mean stupid. People can be intelligent and they can still be these things. So it creates a lot of kind of interest, I suppose, for his audience, and it's quite exciting for them that this guy is like, he obviously has like something about him that he's kind of sensitive to the vibe of the whole place being a bit weird and a bit off. And when he talks to Macduff, he's actually quite witty. He has a lot of jokes that he makes, and puns, and they're all quite clever. So he has some perceptive comments about what's going on around him, even though he doesn't actually know. He sort of picks up on the feeling of it, and he has a combination of being drunk but also being insightful, and that kind of tension provides the comedy of the scene. So sometimes he's really silly, but then every so often he has a comment or remark that is unusually clear or very kind of forward thinking or very accurate. So probably my favorite thing that he says that makes me giggle is that he's kind of going on for ages about this gates of hell thing, like I was saying at the beginning, And then he sort of goes off on a side tangent and he's like, oh, it can't be hell after all because it's way too cold to be hell. And obviously that conjures up the image of the idea that hell is full of fire, which is sort of surprising for an audience because they don't, even though hell is full of fire and you burn in hell, hell is meant to be a place of suffering, not like a nice, warm, cozy place. So it's sort of funny that he's kind of, in his mind, hell would be nice because it's warm. So he's kind of a bit silly that way. It's like a really weird thing, like a very odd comment for someone of this day to make, that like, suggesting that hell might be actually nicer than where he is now, even because at least it would be warm. And it also has a go. So that's this point here, implying it might be nicer to work for the devil than Macbeth, because at least if he was working for the devil, he'd be surrounded by fire, it'd be nice and warm. And he's also kind of suggesting that Macbeth is sort of stingy and doesn't really like pay for the heating properly or that kind of thing, which is sort of funny because it's such a like minor point. Like we're dealing with this kind of psychopathic murderer who's been on like a rampage and is like killing everyone around him, and the porter's moaning about the fact that he doesn't pay for heating. And obviously because we know Macbeth really well, we'd be like, of course he doesn't pay for heating. But from the porter's point of view, he doesn't know all this about Macbeth, so he's just like, oh, this nasty boss who won't pay for my heating. So again, it's kind of like this dramatic irony where we know more than he does, and it's creating this comic effect. So a couple of final points then. He only appears at this point. This is the only time that we see this little guy. And he's by himself and he's just kind of blathering on in a drunken way. And then when he lets Macduff in, who's the guy who's banging on the gates, he speaks to Macduff. So Macduff is obviously super serious and very professional, and the porter is very kind of all over the place. So again, that interaction between them you can analyze as well. Creates more comedy. As a final note, this is more contextual. One thing I really love about Shakespeare, hopefully you can tell from these courses that I love Shakespeare because I'm always going on about him, aren't I? So he uses comic elements in his tragedies and tragic elements in his comedies, and that creates this really crazy little counterpoint, or this like balance in what he writes, which is really clever, and not many people do it, and people who do it don't do it well, and he obviously does it and does it well. So it's really a complex, interesting thing to be able to talk about in his plays, especially this one, that there's just like a random comic figure just dumped into this tragic world, and it sharpens the tragic effect. So everything goes a lot more downhill after Act 2.2. And this is 2.3, obviously, so it's straight after that. So Duncan's murdered in between 2.1 and 2.2. So it just kind of gets darker and darker from that point. And so this like little moment of comic relief makes us quite amused, and it slightly lightens the tone after this really climactic murder that happens off stage. So we're kind of frustrated by it because we don't even get to see it, this murder. And and then there's this kind of like silly little scene, and then it plunges us into the full downfall of Macbeth and how he descends into total violence, total madness, and chaos. So it heightens all of the kind of chaos that's later to come, because it just like lifts us for a moment, lifts our spirits, and then properly like hammers home the rest of the tragedy. So yeah, there we go. There's some points for you on the Porter. Spend a bit longer with this lesson, go back through it all. Obviously, I've kind of whizzed through it as I always do with my lessons, so feel free to kind of rewatch or pause and read through the points and so on. So hopefully you've enjoyed this lesson, and hopefully you're feeling a little less confused by this guy. He is meant to be confusing, so you're kind of on the right track if you are confused by him. I really like him, and I find him a really interesting character, and sort of unnecessary, but also really kind of interesting, like sort of cool that he puts him in there. So hopefully you like him too, and you're going to enjoy analysing him in essays. And and it's good that you've revised him, so well done for having a look at this lesson, and hopefully you'll enjoy all the other Macbeth lessons as well on the Scribbly course, and I'll see you guys soon.